Welcome to today's lecture on the reign of Elizabeth I. Today we will study the question, to what extent did rural society and the economy change under Elizabeth? This lecture will be split into 4 parts. Firstly, we will examine the changes and continuities of the rural social hierarchy. We will then study the developments in farming that helped to produce more food and achieve greater profits. Then we will study the practice of enclosure in greater detail, so to understand the extent to which the country had shifted from arable to pastoral farming. Finally, we will examine the causes of rural poverty, so to understand why vagrancy became a problem in the late Elizabethan age. Let's begin by examining the social hierarchy of rural society. This is based on the concept of the great chain of being, with the wealthiest landowners, the nobility, at the top, and the least fortunate, known as vagrants, at the bottom. This structure had not changed from the Norman conquest to Henry VII's reign. However, the break with Rome and changes to agrarian farming meant that this hierarchy was changing. Let's examine the nobility first. These are those with the title of Duke, Marquis, Earl, or Baron. The nobility were the largest landowners and wealthiest social group. However, they were not as powerful as they had been during the late medieval age. Henry VII took measures to curb the power of the nobility with his attack on vested feudalism, and then the break with Rome saw the rise of new men from the gentry gaining greater political influence, especially in their role as MPs of Parliament. It was the gentry who also benefited from the cheap sale of monastic lands in the 1540s. This gave them a local power base and greater influence over the justice system and local government. In contrast, the nobility remained conservative and were the main supporters of the Marian restoration of the Catholic faith. Therefore, when Elizabeth succeeded the throne, the influence of the traditional nobility once again declined. This is perhaps best exemplified by the 1569 Northern Rebellion, which was a revolt of the northern Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, who felt sidelined from court politics. Historians have also seen the Elizabethan era as the age when the House of Lords declined in political influence, since Elizabeth received the most amount of resistance to her settlement from the Marian bishops who sat in the Lords. Whilst the influence of the traditional nobility appeared to shrink, there was a notable growth of the power of the gentry. They had bought into the English Reformation when they had purchased former monastic lands during Henry's reign, and many had also been commissioners during Edward's reign, and so profited from the plunder of the parish churches. By Elizabeth's reign, they had established themselves as influential landowners in the localities. This can be best exemplified by the growth of the role of justices of the peace, an unpaid role that would go to members of the local gentry. During Elizabeth's reign, they were not only responsible for overseeing the quarterly sessions and so administering justice in serious crimes across their country, they were now placed in charge of the collection of the poor rate and distribution of the poor relief to those who they deemed worthy of financial support. This gave them status in their local region and the power to fine or punish those who did not comply. Furthermore, Orthodox historians like John Neal have argued that the gentry became a more politicized group during the Elizabethan age, exemplified in the so-called Puritan choir in the House of Commons, who acted as an opposition group to the crown. This power and influence would only grow further in the Stuart age. The other group that grew in wealth and influence during the Elizabethan age was the yeomen. These were freeholders. In other words, they owned their own agricultural land. The amount of land each yeoman owned varied, with the smaller freeholders known as husbandmen. Many of these yeomen benefited from the change in agrarian practices. Their fathers or grandfathers had bought the land of other yeomen, enclosed this land, and used it to practice sheep farming. There was a boom in the wool industry under Elizabeth, and so these yeomen were able to profit greatly from sheep grazing. This meant that some yeomen would become as rich as the gentry and would then look to gain important positions in local government. They would eventually develop into the traditional country squires that would have great sway in the Civil War of the mid-17th century. The tenant farmers are the closest social group to what we can call the traditional peasant. They were mostly engaged in agrarian or crop farming, and they occupied a tenancy of a strip of land from the local landowner, who was usually a member of the gentry or a yeoman. Most of these tenancies were passed from father to son, and so kept within the family. These farmers lived relatively comfortable lives since they had the security of their tenancy. They were subsistence farmers, so grew a sufficient amount of food to feed their families, pay their rents, and perhaps sell a small surplus at the local market. In this way, their lives looked very different to the lives of their grandfathers during Henry VII's reign. The most discussed and debated social group of the Elizabethan age was the landless labourers. Traditionally, historians have argued that these labourers had been forced to give up their tenancies by greedy landlords who wanted to enclose the land and use it to farm sheep. Certainly there is evidence for this, particularly in East Anglia and the southeast, and previous Tudor governments had begun to investigate the problem. For example, in the 1510s, Wolsey completed an investigation into the enclosure of common land, and the Duke of Somerset then completed a larger survey of the practice of enclosure in the late 1540s. However, revisionist historians have argued that the existence of this new class of landless labourers is not solely down to the practice of enclosure. Inflation rose throughout the second half of the 16th century, making it harder for farmers to afford their rent. Furthermore, there was consistent population growth. This meant that there were more peasants, and so the demand for tenancies of arable land would naturally increase. As a result of all these problems combined, there was a growth in the landless labourer class. Landless labourers relied on seasonal work and would often move from farm to farm looking for work. During peak season, such as during the harvest, this wasn't a problem because demand outstripped supply. However, in the low season, such as winter, there was not enough work for landless labourers, and since they had no fixed address, they would often resort to begging. This turned landless labourers into vagrants, who by the late Elizabethan age were considered a public nuisance. Let's now examine the improvements made to farming during the Elizabethan period. Some of these came about by developments in technology or in the changes from arable to pastoral farming. These new and improved methods were communicated more widely across rural communities as a result of the development in the printing press. By the Elizabethan age, the printing press was responsible for the production of a range of new literature, not just religious works or poetry for the entertainment of the aristocracy. Now it was also responsible for the release of manuals that educated farmers on better practices. This improved farming efficiency, however. A byproduct of this was that traditional farming techniques were being phased out, and these were the more labor-intensive methods. This then contributed to the rising unemployment of landless laborers. One key development was called the up and down system. This was when a field would alternate between being used as pasture, or for animal grazing, or for arable farming. This meant that a field did not need to lie fallow for a year so that the nutrients in the soil could replenish. This new system also shows that some landowners were not completely turning their arable fields into pasture, but were taking a blended approach that would result in greater profits. There was also improvement in the use of fertilizer. Traditionally, farmers would use animal dung. However, Farmers were now beginning to use vegetable compost and even town waste to fertilize crops. This meant that crop yields were better, and this would help to mitigate the rise in food prices. In addition, farmers were beginning to use virgin land. This was land that had never previously been cultivated. These included salt marshes and marshland that had been too difficult to cultivate using traditional methods. In this instance, the new methods were not causing unemployment for landless laborers. Instead, it was potentially opening up new work opportunities. There were also developments in animal breeding. This was especially important for those landlords who had chosen to enclose their land and use it to specialize in a specific breed. New textbooks were printed and distributed. For example, one successful textbook displayed the best methods of breeding and then fattening up calves for cattle farmers. Let's now examine the causes of social change under Elizabeth. We will begin by examining the practice of enclosure. This was when private landowners would fence off land to graze sheep or other farm animals. The practice was especially controversial when landowners fenced off common land, which was communal land used by the tenant farmers to graze their animals. The practice was necessary so that selective breeding could take place. This meant that only sheep of the same breed were put together so to produce the finest quality of wool. This could not happen in common land as there would be a varied assortment of breeds for different types of animals. One common misconception was that enclosure took place on a nationwide scale, so that by the end of Elizabeth's reign, there was more pastoral farmers than agrarian farmers. This wasn't the case. The regions most affected by enclosure were East Anglia and the South East. This included the counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex and Kent, and the second largest town in England, Norwich. There were a number of ports on the south east and towns surrounding the Thames estuary that benefited from the growth in the cloth trade. Therefore, it makes sense that it was the surrounding countryside that was enclosed for sheep farming. This is also shown by how the Ickek rebellion of Edward's reign, primarily motivated by the practice of enclosure, took place in East Anglia. There were other regions of England that primarily used enclosure and pastoral farming, including the south and northwest of England. However, it is worth noting that both these regions are highland regions, especially the northwest, as that includes the Lake District, Pennines and Yorkshire Dales. These highland regions were sparsely populated and had been sheep farming for centuries, and so the practice of enclosure would have a minimal impact on rural poverty. The regions now highlighted in orange show where the practice of enclosure had become more prevalent, but still only constituted around 50% of the type of farming for that region. This means the other 50% was still arable crop farming using the traditional strip farming method. We can see this includes the Welsh border, the south coast and Cambridgeshire. These were mostly lowland regions that traditionally would have been used for arable farming. They would have some issues with rural poverty, since there was less land for peasants to take on as tenancies, and so they would be forced to become landless labourers, but the issue was not as serious as it was in East Anglia and the South East. Finally, we can see that a large swathe of the country, especially the Midlands, Yorkshire and Northumbria, had seen very little change in farming practices. These regions were less populated than the south and also less affluent. There were fewer large towns and less chance for social mobility. However, this apparent stagnation meant that the vast majority of peasants did not become landless labourers and so had less of a chance of falling into rural poverty. Let's now examine other causes of rural poverty. The first reason was population growth. Throughout the Tudor age, the population rose. This is because the rural economy was fairly stable. There were very few harvest failures, and their years of civil war were over. However, during Elizabeth's reign, the population of England rose from approximately 2.5 million people to 4 million. That means that England's population rose by just over one-third. Therefore, families were having more children, and more were surviving infancy, and this meant more mouths to feed. This increased the demand for food staples such as cereal. When these children grow into adults, they would be competing with one another for tenancies or seasonal work, and with workforce supply outstripping demand, landlords could increase rents or lower wages. This would naturally lead to the least fortunate falling into poverty. With a higher population, the demand for staple foods, like cereal, grew, and this led to scarcity in some areas. This naturally drove food prices up in the worst affected regions. Landlords were keen to capitalize on this increase, often increasing the price of grain above the rate of inflation. And since there was no government regulation in the Elizabethan age, they were essentially able to profit from the distress of the peasants. Population growth was not the only reason for the increase in food prices. Inflation continued to increase throughout the Elizabethan age. This is when basic goods and necessities become more expensive, often due to factors outside government control. The main reason for inflation during the late 16th century was the amount of silver bullion that was arriving into Europe from the New World, most of which had been discovered by the Spanish. Since there was now more silver in circulation, its value decreased, and so silver coins were worth less. The coinage had only recently recovered from the great debasement of the 1540s. It was the labourers who suffered most from this, as any surplus grain they tried to sell at market was not worth the same amount as it had done the year before. Finally, harvest failings continue to act as a contributing factor to rural poverty. Harvest failings were nearly always outside the government's control. It was due to the amount of rainfall throughout the year. For example, an especially hot summer would cause harvest failing from drought. However, until 1590, the harvest was no worse than it had been under previous Tudor monarchs. Between 1594 and 1597, England saw for successive seasons of harvest failure. This meant that by 1596, staple food, especially wheat, was scarce. This resulted in a sharp rise in food prices that would have been felt nationwide. In the worst affected areas, plague broke out due to malnutrition, and in the very worst of cases, peasants starved. It is for this reason that the late 1590s has often been considered a blight on Elizabeth's otherwise prosperous reign. Let's now consider the extent to which rural society changed during Elizabeth's reign. Firstly, it is important to remember that England remained in a pre-industrial age, with the vast majority of the population living as farmers in rural communities. They lived a subsistence lifestyle, whereby they lived off the land, and many did not migrate away from their home county, or even their home village. This was especially true for the Midlands and the North, where the vast majority of farmers remained arable farmers, and most likely took on the same tenancy as their forefathers. However, we cannot ignore the fact that more farmers had lost their tenancies, and so essentially lost their job security. They had to move from one farm to another searching for work. They were essentially working on the Tudor equivalent to a 0-hour contract. This meant that poverty became a greater social concern, something which will be discussed in a later lecture. Most vagrants would roam to their local market town. They would look for work, but when no work could be found, they would resort to begging. It wouldn't be long before the local authorities shooed them out of town. This meant they moved to the next largest town. Many then turned their sights to the capital of London. This meant the late Elizabethan age saw a rising pattern of rural to urban migration. Large towns in the south, and especially the capital, saw a sharp increase in population as a result. Let's now return to our overarching question of, to what extent did rural society and the economy change under Elizabeth? Firstly, it is worth noting that the so-called Great Chain of Being remained a strong feature of rural society. The vast majority of the population were therefore traditional peasant farmers. However, there were some shifts within the Great Chain of Being. The size of the gentry class grew, as did their local political influence. Yeomen were also becoming more affluent due to the changes in farming practice. However, on the other end, there were far more farmers who had no tenancy and so became landless labourers, and also a growth in the number of peasants forced to become vagrants. There were some key farming developments during the Elizabethan age. These were communicated widely across the country due to the advances in the printing press. These included changes to land usage, new types of fertilizer, and new practices for animal breeding. The landscape of England continued to change as landowners continued to enclose their land for pastoral farming, especially given the boom in the wool and cloth industry. However, this was not a nationwide phenomenon. It was far more common in East Anglia, the southeast and other lowland areas, where there was a denser and more affluent population. It would be too simplistic to say that enclosure was the full cause of rural poverty in Elizabethan England. There were other factors that were outside the control of both the government and the landowners, such as population growth, inflation, and harvest failings. Combined, these factors did result in social issues, and it also meant that many landless labourers moved to towns in search of work. This did mark a key change in Elizabethan society. This is something we will explore in greater detail in the following two lectures on urban society and the government's policies toward the poor. Thank you for listening.